And welcome to the Summer 2023 Chief Examiner Feedback for A-Level English Language. The aim for this brief session is to feedback on each of the examined components for the GCE A-Level English Language qualification from the Summer 2023 series, drawing attention to the characteristics of higher and lower level achievement. We shall look at each component in turn, starting with Component 1, 9EN01, Language Variation, Component 2, 9EN02, Child Language, and Component 3, 9EN03, Language Investigation. Component 1. The key to this exam really lies in the wording of the titles, so it's useful to spend some time with students teasing out the details of the paper heading. Taken as a whole, this paper is all about language variation across the two sections. Candidates investigate the ways in which language varies in the world around us, with a particular focus on identity and language change. This can be a rewarding and relevant discussion for students as it relates to ideas and concepts in their everyday lives and the media that surrounds them. Both sections require a specific focus for students, and they should understand the two different parameters to enable flexible application of language frameworks in order to keep their response relevant and focused. Section A, Identity. In Section A, students are focusing on the concept of identity and how the language features used by speakers or writers reflect a person's social and personal identity. When students are applying frameworks and concepts, they need to select the best ideas which allow them to target the feature of language that helps them explore this presentation of identity. In the past, data sets have been linked by concepts such as gender, profession, life circumstances, and opinion. This year, the candidates were exploring the representation of two female personas who had experienced professional conflict and used this to develop a connection with their audience. Application of theory is a key part of this paper. Many candidates focused on gender theory, but sometimes at the expense of other theories, and this resulted in lower achievement for AO2 as a range of concepts and issues were not always applied. While there were many opportunities to explore gender theory, the best responses were those that moved beyond the simple acceptance or listing of Lakoff's gender theory and became more discriminating and critical by considering the influence of context, and so creating links to AO3, on the speaker and writer's language and how this affected the forms used. This included exploring how certain language features enhanced the sense of frustration that could be felt by the speakers and writers in Section A. At the lowest levels, candidates often attempted to use the data to support some of these older gender theories, which was seldom persuasive. As just mentioned, considering how context, mode, field, audience and function affect language and presentation of identity is a key focus of this section, with the expectation that candidates use a range of language features from different levels to support their exploration. At lower levels, candidates didn't often consider the specific context of the data, and for language features tended to focus almost exclusively on lexis. Often, such candidates were not always careful in their application of terminology, showing basic errors, for example, mislabeling of person on pronouns. As candidates progressed through the levels, there were more explicit links to context, and a more confident knowledge of the structure of English was in evidence, with clear and controlled examples from the data being used to illustrate aspects of syntax at the level of the phrase, clause, and sentence. As in all components for English language exams, students may encounter spoken texts. In this case, in Section A. As is usual in such cases, the IPA is used to indicate key aspects of accent, both features of regional or standard pronunciation, as well as casual, and some basic prosodic features, such as stress and rising intonation. To support candidates in their application, they are given a phonemic reference sheet at the start of the paper. Most candidates did attempt to discuss phonology, but at lower levels this seldom went beyond reproducing the IPA already in the data. The most successful candidates went beyond merely noting that phonology and aspects of prosodics, and went on to consider in detail how and why elements of identity were being enhanced by such features, and used the IPA to illustrate standard forms or common variants. The best responses to this task also kept their focus on the question and were careful to link their explanations to a range of identities. Section B, Language Change. Both sections of Component 1 assess AO4, the connections that can be made in the data sets, and responses should offer a balance of analysis across both texts. With this in mind, responding to the data set in Section B requires a range of connections that relate to the ways in which a specific type or genre of language has changed over time in response to social, cultural, or technological factors. Genre and purpose can be a very helpful consideration here as students explore the changes and similarities in the language features used in each piece of data and relate theories and perceptions of change from their 2-year study. This year, students were exploring appeals for donations in a letter and a modern internet-based appeal. Text A reflected some of the more formal communication, by today's standards, from the late 19th century, and its syntax reflected the expectations of the time and the mode of communication. In contrast, the GoFundMe appeal was more indicative of the relaxed and individual approach characteristic of the digital landscape, with the broader, possibly international audience allowing for more flexibility and freedom of personal expression. Although many candidates were able to identify these broad differences between the two pieces of data, it tended to be only mid-levels and above that closely considered the many similarities in these appeals and the methods used to gain sympathy from the receiver. At top levels, candidates were aware of where there had been a lack of change, and candidates identified similar language structures across the two pieces of data that functioned in different ways, and vice versa. Similarly to Section A, candidates at the lower levels typically applied a very narrow range of language features, allowing lexical issues to dominate their responses. This also limited AO1 awarding, as the range of terminology was not present, while at upper levels there was confident discussion and exemplification of more complex features from the level of syntax and an exploration of inferred meanings. It's important to note that although it may be tempting to explore concepts relating to, in this case, identity and persuasion, the focus should be on comparing and contrasting how the language has or has not changed in a specific context, and students should be aware that theories relating to each paper need to be applied judiciously. Taking the paper as a whole, there was some evidence that candidates struggled to balance their time for each section. It's worth noting that each section carries equal marks, but some candidates were producing much shorter Section B responses. Component 2, Child Language. 9EN02 can examine either spoken or written language, and while there is some significant overlap in the skills and knowledge needed to explore these different modes, there are also significant differences in how the data can be approached and the type of theories, concepts and issues that students apply, as well as the language features and contextual factors. This year's paper asked students to explore 4 written texts produced over several months by Celine. There was no expectation that the text be discussed in equal depth, but the best responses acknowledged each piece of data at some point in their analysis. Perhaps one of the most significant aspects of analysing written language is a focus on context, how language is affected by its mode, field, audience and function. As this is an area that showed some variation across responses, it's worth discussing here. The expectation is that students use their knowledge of grammar and syntax to explore issues such as the language features that are significant to the function or type of text, narrative, instruction piece, recount, recall, etc., to show how the child may be aware of the audience's needs. At lower levels, the type of text was seldom mentioned, and there was little sense of the types of text that Celine was producing. If context was mentioned, it tended to not be linked to language features, or vice versa. At higher levels, not only was Celine's ability to produce different sorts of written text at the forefront of the response, many candidates were aware that there was often a significant overlap between the different contextual factors. Commons included areas such as sentence moods, imperative, direct or mitigated, declaratives, interrogatives, exclamations, use of a variety of methods of noun description such as adjective, noun phrase modifiers, subject complements, etc. For these, the best candidates looked closely at the type and function of the description that Celine was offering, such as colour or physical appearance, or where she avoided excessive description, her use of adverbials for sequencing information, or providing information on time, place, manner or reason. Most candidates did identify and discuss sentence type, simple, compound or complex, but at mid and lower levels this was often merely identification, with only higher level candidates considering this as both an aspect of literacy and the advantages it offered in terms of function. For example, the simple sentences in the instructional text made it easier to follow, or the compound sentences in later text allowing two related concepts to be discussed in one unit. And use this information to show how Celine understood the demands of written language and mode. The discussion of spelling was once again a key area of difference between responses. At lower levels, the IPA was not used, with candidates instead using standard letters to represent speech sounds. At higher levels, the IPA was used to represent phoneme-grapheme correspondence, and candidates attempted to spot patterns as evidence of learning and showed awareness of the irregularity of the spelling system, while considering how the audience would respond to Celine's spelling. At higher levels, clear knowledge of the phonics approach was seen, with candidates using key terms such as segmenting and blending, as well as noting the child's approach to tricky words and learned spelling strategies. Some were even aware of the order in which the sound-letter combinations were likely taught and used this to explain the non-standard aspects of Celine's spelling. Applying theories, concepts and issues associated with the development of literacy is also a key aspect of this paper that show variation across responses. There are no prescribed approaches here, and many candidates use theories, concepts and issues from other parts of the course, such as narrative theory, and adapt some spoken acquisition theory, as well as applying some theories more closely associated with written language. At lower levels, theory application tended to be descriptive, with descriptive outlines of the theory, e.g. Kroll or phonics teaching, being provided, but not connected to the data in any way. At the lower levels, theories were often confused and muddled with other theories, and it was very common to see Chomsky and innateness referenced, despite written language not being an innate skill. To be successful, candidates perhaps need to consider evidence of where the child is attempting to perceive patterns in an often irregular system to draw parallels with their approach to spoken language. Kroll and Gentry remain popular despite not explaining the acquisition of written language. As already mentioned, lower level candidates tended to just list features, but at higher levels a more discriminating approach was seen. For example, linking phonetic spelling to phonics teaching or discussing where Celine deviated from Kroll's model. Environmental print was often applied somewhat bluntly at the lower levels, with students stating that Celine would be able to spell, say, museum because she had visited one. But at higher levels, candidates were aware of the range of environmental influences, including the classroom. Educational goals, such as the Key Stage DFE guidelines and what skills the teacher is focusing upon, are increasingly common and very productive. Candidates used teacher comments and the type of activity to focus in on what the teacher was trying to achieve, and drew distinction between the teacher allowing Celine to develop her literacy without correction, a creative approach, and the benefits of such an approach balanced with where the teacher was guiding Celine towards more standard form, a more rules-based approach. Students at higher levels were able to quote the DFE goals and show how Celine was meeting or exceeding these without a deficit approach. Many of the skills assessed by AO1 are common to all papers, as well as this paper specifically. For some candidates, examples were an issue, as they were often overlong. For example, writing out a whole sentence to illustrate an adjective or noun phrase not only lacks precision, but over the course of a response can pinch at the time available candidates as well. As well as overlong examples, some candidates didn't include illustrative examples for significant stretches of their response or had a really narrow range. In some instances, multiple examples can be used to show where and how a child has firmly grasped a skill, where they are variable, or where there might be interesting patterns to discuss. Terminology is another key area of AO1, with both range and accuracy being assessed, so there is a crossover with AO3. Candidates are advised, if possible, to check the accuracy of their terms. It was particularly noticeable this series that errors were creeping in, with the most noticeable being students describing the imperatives in text A as declaratives, mislabeling sentence types, and making errors with Pearson when discussing pronouns. Whilst in many instances these felt like errors caused by candidates working in formal exam conditions for the first time, markers were unable to give any leeway unless candidates used the correct term in subsequent sections. Range of terminology can be improved through use of terms from different language levels, e.g. modified noun phrase modifiers, adjectives, subject complements, adjective phrases, adverbial, prepositional phrase, etc. Component 3. Language investigation. Section A. In general, it was clear that the majority of students were confident with this question and were aware of how to approach the task. It was also clear from the responses that the vast majority of candidates had at least some familiarity with their subtopic and were able to access and apply the sources that had been recommended in the pre-release material. While these sources are by no means a comprehensive or definitive list of materials, it was clear that the majority of students had been well prepared about how to apply their research to the data. However, it was evident that some students struggled with how to present and convey their research effectively, and a useful document in this respect can be found on the Pearson website, and the link is on the screen for you. It is important that students are aware that they need to analyse a range of linguistic methods and frameworks using a range of accurate and appropriate terminology. In some of the most popular questions, i.e. the gender and journalism tasks, a number of candidates only focused on lexis. In some cases, this resulted in a somewhat descriptive or generalised comments about the data. The most successful candidates addressed a range of frameworks, giving them a much wider range of terminology to apply, and they made logical connections between the methods used to convey meaning, while being aware that wider contextual factors could affect the data. For example, a number of higher achieving responses analysed the use of active voice when discussing the presentation of the male character in the gender texts versus the passive constructions used to remove the female character's agency. It is also worth noting that some candidates failed to fully address the question about whether or not the data was representative of the ways in which language is used for their particular subtopic, or only focused on where the data was representative. For example, while a number of candidates commented on the use of imperatives in the language and power question, they did not always link this usage to the genre or face-to-face fitness instruction. At much higher levels, candidates kept the focus of the question in mind throughout and were much more willing to isolate language features that were not typically associated with the subtopic and speculated plausibly as to why they were present, often using aspects of context. Section B. It was clear that a number of candidates had undertaken significant independent research and were able to use their own data to fully explore the statements attached to their chosen subtopics. The vast majority of candidates had carefully selected data that was valid for their chosen topic, and it was evident that a number of them had undertaken research in addition to the recommendations in the pre-release material. Although moving beyond the material in the pre-release can increase the number of sources and the range of theories, concepts and issues, it is not essential to achieve higher levels. The key is to apply theories and concepts and issues more thoughtfully and to consider how and why the data may deviate from expectations. There were a number of cases where it was clear that candidates had over-rehearsed certain focuses and were unable to address the task. For example, some candidates for the language of fitness instruction question had investigated whether the gender of the speaker affected the way the language was used, but did not discuss the way these speakers adopted an authoritative or friendly manner in order to make their instructions effective, so had not focused on language and power. Similarly, a number of the gender respondents did not focus on the roles of the characters, i.e. the victim, the perpetrator, the detective, but instead exclusively discussed women's role in society, rather than addressing their function within the text. There were a number of incidences where it was clear that candidates had the same data and investigative hypotheses focusing on exactly the same quotations with almost identical comments about the language points being made. The spirit of this paper is very much to encourage independent research rather than a teacher-led approach. This was often apparent in the gender question, where some candidates were analysing quotations from characters whose narrative roles they did not fully understand. Centres are encouraged to allow students the freedom to research subtopics independently and develop skills necessary for their future steps. Thank you for attending this feedback session. I hope you have found it useful.